Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll just have to hold on to this thing. um, Welcome. I'm Marjorie Scala. I'm the current president of the League of Women Voters of Columbia, Boone County, and I welcome you all here as we honor our founders on this day. It's been 105 years. I haven't been here for all of it, but I'm beginning to feel like um, I just want to welcome everyone, and I want to say thank you to all of you. We had an incredible season of volunteering leading up to the November election, and so many people pitched in to do voter registration. We kind of expanded our portfolio into voter education and get out the vote activities. And I especially want to single out for praise Liz Schmidt, who's here in the front row. Who just did an incredible job of organizing all that. I appreciate it. We are dealing with a lot as we face the upcoming legislative session. And I know this is a time when many of us are feeling a bit discouraged, especially those of us who have been fighting for women's rights for many decades and kind of see things going backwards in some respects. But I want to point out that the situation in Missouri, both of the ballot initiatives that the League supported did pass and will be implemented. Hurrah! And as we find our way forward, I think we're going to have some words of encouragement as we look back at the history and about how hard the suffragists fought to get the vote in the first place. And we can vote. We have the vote now. So just need to get more people to exercise that. And that's a core part of our mission. So our first order of business on the agenda is to include the Liz Schmidt Community Service Award. This is the highest award that the League gives, and we give it usually annually, even every year. But it is going to recognize a group within the community community service in its very basic level. And this year, the award is going to the Como Mobile Aid Collective. I'm going to read some good stuff about you first. On Como Mobile Aid Collective's website, there's a very brief history of the organization's beginning. It reads, quote, "It all started with a hot pot of soup, cups and spoons, served out of the back of a Subaru on a cold winter day in 2018. That statement captures the heart and soul of this organization. It began as an ad hoc, loosely organized group of individuals who decided that, yes, they could make a difference in the lives of the homeless in Columbia. They didn't need an organizational structure or concrete facility or even a business plan. They didn't need a bank account with funds to operate. All they needed were some people willing to make pots of hot soup and help deliver them to homeless individuals living in the camps around Columbia. There was a real sense of teamwork in the organization. Some people would make pots of soup and deliver them early in the morning to the doorsteps of other volunteers, who in turn would make sure the soup was hot, loaded in the back of a car, and deliver it. At the end of the day, pots were washed and placed back on the porch to be picked up. Como Mobile Aid Collective was unique because in many ways it was spontaneous and inorganic and remains so to this day. Its services and impact have grown and evolved to include medical care, pet services, provision of clothing and shoes, as well as food. But it continues to function as a group of caring individuals guided by their hearts and led by the skillful leadership of Kat Armbruster, the director of Como Mobile Aid. Come on down, Kat. It's very fitting that we honor Como Mobile Aid today because they truly embody the spirit of community service for which this award is given.
Make me cry. Thank you so much. See if I can juggle everything here and give you an actual. Oh, there's Susie to take our picture.
Shannon's doing it.
Sure.
Thank you. Here, you want to come? I was gonna do candid shots, but here I go. Shannon, you got it for
Thank
us
you.
too. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you. Well deserved. Thank you. Is it okay if I say a few words?
Yes, please.
Can I borrow that though?
I feel like crying a little bit, y'all. It's so interesting to think about like where we came from and where we are now, because it feels very structured, but also simultaneously organic. So I wrote just a little bit just about community service and what we do. So the idea of community service feels very normal to me. I grew up watching my mom provide pro bono legal services for domestic violence survivors. And so I feel really honored to be here with y'all today celebrating your Founders Day, like 105 years of rocking out issues to encourage people to like make good choices when voting is amazing. So thank you all for the work you do. I had the privilege of the time and support to be able to volunteer for Como Mobile Aid for 3 years before becoming one of the first paid staff, which is still miraculous to me that happened. We rely on an amazing group of volunteers, including Shannon, who I met and she got involved with us last year when we came and did a panel discussion for you guys. Thank you, Barbara, and everybody for inviting us. So that's been wonderful. Shannon now helps me with our newsletter and a bunch of other stuff. So I'm so glad that we met. Thank you. And so I love this amazing group of volunteers who do feel called in their hearts to help folks survive so they can move on to hopefully thrive. It feels very obvious to us as a group that we should feed our neighbors, make sure they have appropriate layers for the season, and offer accessible healthcare and hygiene. And it's really strange to me to think about that there are people in town who believe that we are doing like the worst thing imaginable. We really have a hate group that hates us. It's bizarre. So it warms our hearts to know that there's more love than hate in this town. We truly appreciate you all recognizing and valuing our mission. And no matter what happens in the next 4 years, we plan to move forward with faith and action to protect and serve our community's most vulnerable population. So thank you all so much. We really appreciate it. Well, thinking about inviting a speaker for today to help us celebrate our Founders Day, we were looking for someone who could sort of illuminate our present moment through a knowledge of history, and specifically history of our foremothers, the suffragists. And we found the perfect person, Dr. Catherine Rymph. Before she accepted the position, she is the Dean of the Honors College at Mizzou. Before she accepted that position, she served as both the chair of the History Department and the interim chair of the Religious Studies Department. She's taught and lectured in the Honors College and directed many honors theses since her arrival on MU's campus in 2000. And in 2018, she was awarded the Gold Chalk Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching. She's the author of 2 books, one called Raising Government Children, A History of Foster Care and the American Welfare State. And the other is called Republican Women, Feminism and Conservatism from Suffrage to the Rise of the New Right. Her research and teaching interests concern women and American politics, public policy, and child welfare. And she's an affiliate of the Kinder Institute, the WGST. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Before coming to MU, she previously taught at the University of Iowa and was Fulbright lecturer at the University of Greifswald in Germany. And so we're very lucky to have her today. And she's going to talk to us about campaigning for suffrage under a skeptical president.
Great. This is not the first time I've spoken to this group. I really enjoy speaking to the women voters. I've been reminiscing at the table I was at. I know I did a big in-person one in 2019 when we're doing the 100th anniversary. And I have a memory of doing a talk on Zoom during COVID. But those are always a little hard to remember because you don't actually interact with anybody. And so you're just sitting in your office talking to people. And I also wanted to say, I was really interested in the presentation about Coma Mobile Aid, because I know I just very recently was talking with one of our honor students who's a pre-med student who's been volunteering with that clinic and really just finding it a really meaningful experience. So I was glad to hear all of that. So when I talked to Mari about this, she suggested that I talk about a parallel time in the past when it looked like women were struggling for rights in a period of retrenchment. And she thought that would somehow be inspiring. We'll see. So I immediately thought of the Wilson administration, the Woodrow Wilson administration, and those 8 critical years of his presidency from 1913 to 1921 that encompassed the acceleration of the suffrage movement, culminating in ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, because I think it's an important part of that story that people understand that the 19th Amendment was achieved under a president who was at best indifferent, and really you better to describe him as actually quite hostile to women's voting rights and to suffragists in general. And yet they did it. They got through that. I guess that's the inspiring part. Let's see. Did we lose our tech person?
Well, she's not the right screen.
Because I should be able to advance it.
Yeah, you keep.
Let me try this one. Nope. Let's see if I do it this way. Okay, I don't know.
Let me try one thing. You just keep talking.
Okay, I'll just keep talking. So the first slide that was going to go up is just a little bit of stuff about the 19th century. And I should say that I suspect that many of the things that we're talking about, a lot of you already know, because you're, interested in women's rights and students of history. So I hope that nothing that I tell you, I hope you get something new out of it. But I find this a really interesting topic to talk about. That's just great. Wonderful. So there is a whole movement for women's voting rights in the 19th century that I'm not really going to talk about. But those Reconstruction amendments are the amendments that are ratified right after the Civil War that define citizenship as if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen. It provides citizenship to former enslaved people and grant certain rights of citizenship, equal protection under the law, for example. And the 15th Amendment provides for voting rights for Black men. And there's a whole debate around the ratification of those amendments about whether women's voting rights will also be included in those amendments. They were not. Some suffragists did try to vote anyway and see what would happen. And then in a really important Supreme Court case called Minor versus Hepperset, the Supreme Court rules that the 14th Amendment does include women as citizens. They're born in the United States, and so they are citizens. But that voting is not one of the privileges of citizenship, that it's actually a matter of the states. So essentially what that meant was, going forward, there's two paths for women to achieve voting rights. One is to amend the Constitution, get a separate amendment enfranchising women. And the other was to embark on a state-by-state campaign to put suffrage into state constitutions. And suffragists try both of those things. They do both of them. But the amendment itself is really hard because of the complexities of amending the Constitution in the first place. It's very, very difficult. And the dominance of the southern states, the states of the former Confederacy, which are quite skeptical of federal interference in voting rights in the states, that's going to make it very difficult. Everyone understands that, to ratify another amendment that is about voting rights. 3/4 of the states would have to ratify an amendment. In 1875, that was 28 of 37 states. And I'm showing you this map right here so you can see what a large percentage of the existing states at the mid-century were in the South and were just very unlikely to ever ratify a women's suffrage amendment. So while suffragists are trying that, they're also trying the state by state approach. There were two suffrage organizations in the late 19th century, the National Association for Women's Suffrage and the American Association for Women's Suffrage. They join up in 1890 to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, usually referred to as NASA, because that's kind of a mouthful. And NASA, of course, is the organization that will become the League of Women Voters in 1920. So they concentrate their efforts on the state-by-state campaign. The first territories and states to grant women the right to vote are all out in the West, as you can see here. Women's suffrage was controversial, lots of opposition to it, but it certainly had supporters, including prominent supporters like many of the Republican presidents of the late 19th century. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt. They had all been suffrage sympathizers. But to say that they were personally sympathetic to the cause of women's suffrage is not the same as to say that they were actively advocating for it. Those are really different questions. Before 1912, no president had formally endorsed a federal amendment, and no political party, none of the major political parties had included it in their platform. But by 1912, there's reason to think things might be different. By 1912, although progress had been slow, if you look at that list of suffrage states, it's pretty low by the turn of the 20th century. Women's suffrage is becoming part of the zeitgeist, something that people are thinking about. There was music and art and popular press that were celebrating women's suffrage. Like, as you see here, there was also popular culture that opposed it. There's so much imagery like that tells you what will happen if women have the right to vote. There's just so much of this. I just picked this one. I've got one other one like that I'm going to show you. But there's a lot of momentum going into the 1912 election for a few reasons. And I'll wait to switch the slide. I think you're trying to take a picture of that slide. So I'm going to wait and okay. So first of all, by 1912, some more states had ratified women's suffrage. Women now had the vote in 6 states. The most recent victories had been in Washington State in 1910 and in California in 1911. So, and in 1912, suffrage was on the ballot in 8 more states, the question of suffrage on 8 additional states. Another reason for this momentum in 1912 was that Alice Paul had returned to the United States in 1910 and had joined the NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this really would shake up the suffrage movement. She was, if you don't know who she is, this is her picture here. She was a young American Quaker who had been studying in England, and while she was there became involved with the militant suffrage movement in Britain. She was jailed and embarked on hunger strikes along with the Pankhursts and others in England. And people knew about her in the U.S. because her activities were covered in the American press. So when she came home, it was a big deal. She immediately joined NASA, and she had her own ideas. NASA at the time was led by Anna Howard Shaw, and she was organizing a whole campaign in 1912 to make suffrage a key issue during the presidential campaign, get people talking about it. So in 1912, it was going to be hard for presidential candidates to ignore the issue. There were 3 major candidates in 1912, which is always interesting. The incumbent was the Republican Taft. he supported state level action on suffrage, not a federal amendment, but he's willing to say, yeah, the state should do this, which, I mean, we've seen that in a lot of our discussions now, right? You can see it as a kind of principled ideological position. I believe constitutionally this is a matter for the states to decide. It can also be a way, if you're running for president, to dodge the question. There's nothing I can do. This needs to be handled at the state level. That was Taft's position. The Republican Party split in 1912, and former President Theodore Roosevelt ran on a third-party ticket called the Progressive Party at the time. He did support the federal amendment. In terms of the Democratic Party, in the Democratic primary, none of the Democratic candidates supported suffrage. They're very sensitive to this issue of the southern states. The Democratic Party dominates the South. The Southern Democrats are very influential in the Democratic Party. The issue of suffrage wasn't really raised at the Democratic Convention. The candidate who was chosen was Woodrow Wilson, who was basically a compromise candidate who emerges at the end. Now, if you know your presidential history at all, you know that, and it's not really a surprise, in this three-way race, Wilson wins. He was the one candidate who basically refused to talk about suffrage at all during the campaign. Even when he was asked directly about it, he had lots of rhetorical maneuvers he would use to get out of answering questions. He had certainly told people of his opposition to suffrage, but his plan for the campaign was just to not talk about it, to try to avoid the subject altogether. In fact, Woodrow Wilson had a long and deep hostility to women in education and women in politics. He was a Southerner. He was born in 1856. He was, I think it's really fair to say, deeply racist. By the time he became president, he's not just racist as sort of a man of his time, but really racist by the standards of the day. He believed, as did the family he grew up in white supremacy and in the idea that a husband and wife should be as one in their opinions and in their identity. It was disorienting and disruptive to think of wives having an identity independent from her husband. It would disrupt family life. The woman he would marry, Ellen Wilson, largely agreed with Woodrow, and these were not unusual views for the time. And as you've already seen, but I'll show you another example since you like the first one so much. There it is. It would come to be a prime motif in the anti-suffrage campaigns of the way that if women vote, it will disrupt family harmony. Women will become men, men will become women. And I don't think you can see it in this. Oh, yeah. And the cats will go crazy if you look at it. Because everything feels very uncomfortable and unstable. So Woodrow Wilson was a romantic. He revered the women in his life in a very sort of chivalrous and sentimental way, but he very much believed in patriarchal authority. So there are many, many wonderful or not so wonderful stories I could tell you about Woodrow Wilson in his younger years, the ways he's displayed this hostility towards educated women and women in politics, or stories of when he was in graduate school at Johns Hopkins, going with a friend to kind of sit in the back and watch a women's rights convention and basically just make fun of the women, calling them old maids and all of that. He had a really miserable experience in his first college teaching job, which unfortunately for him, the only job he was able to find was at the newly founded Bryn Mawr, which was a women's college. So Woodrow Wilson, who really didn't think it was just a waste of time to educate women at university level, he had to waste his time teaching women. It was a job he felt was beneath him. But even worse, he had to report to a woman. His boss, the dean, Carrie Thomas, was highly educated. She had stronger academic credentials than Wilson did because he hadn't finished his PhD yet. She could read foreign languages, which he couldn't do. She was a feminist who believed in educating women, who believed in women's rights. And this was a really uncomfortable position for him all around. And he only lasted 3 years before he left and went somewhere else. He didn't believe in universal suffrage at all, not for women, but also not for all men. He retained opposition to Black men voting and to any kind of racial integration. In 1911, which was the year before he ran for president, when he was serving as president that's when he was serving as president of Princeton. But that year before his presidential run, he was telling audiences of college-educated women that he was definitely and irreconcilably opposed to women's suffrage, that women belonged in the home and that to be involved in politics for women was degrading. In 1912, due to the split in the Republican Party, the Democrats also win control of the Senate and the House. And because of the overrepresentation of the southern states in Congress, it meant that control of the committees that would have to consider suffrage were in the hands of southern leaders. So this man who has a long-standing resistance to women in public life has been elected president. Doesn't look like a really promising time necessarily for the cause of women's suffrage. But in those 1912 elections, Oregon and Arizona were added to the suffrage column. Not all of the referenda resulted in victories, but those two do. It was now the case that 20% of the Senate and over 10% of the House have been elected by constituencies that included women. That's who's being elected from these states where women are enfranchised. So that is some real momentum, and would contribute to the idea that Carrie Catt, who would come to head the NASA in a couple of years, when she was leading NASA, what she called the winning plan, which is you get enough states to enfranchise women, then you just are adding more and more senators and members of Congress who have been elected by constituencies that include women, and that will eventually get you to the federal amendment. So there is some progress in that front. Suffrage was about to move into the home stretch, but the man at the helm, the president, was going to be a really hard sell. Suffragists were not going to make it easy for him to just continue ignoring the subject, which would have been his preference. There's a very famous incident in 1913 that many of you may have heard of before. Suffragists led by Alice Paul organized a massive parade in Washington to occur the day before Wilson's inauguration, so that when he arrives at Union Station for his inauguration, there's nobody there to meet him because they're all there lining the streets to watch this parade. It's really, I think, more accurate to describe it as a pageant. There was so much ceremony and costuming and planning into every detail, what it would look like. It was really magnificent. It was led by Inez Mulholland on a white horse, all of these different delegations representing different aspects of the country and women's participation in the country. 5,000 women processed in an orderly, dignified way. And they were met with heckling. Some members of the crowd rushed at them as they were marching, tearing their hair and their clothing, throwing rocks and bottles. And the BC police largely stood by. There was an outcry over the treatment of the women suffragists. There was even a congressional investigation. And so after Wilson was inaugurated and became president, he did feel like because of that outcry, he actually needed to meet with some suffragists early in his administration, which he did. He received several delegations of suffragists representing different organizations. And the delegations were calling on him to do things like support the Anthony Amendment. The Anthony Amendment was what they called the federal women's suffrage amendment. They wanted him not only to support it, but to also call on the Democratic Congress to pass it. They would ask him directly, President Wilson, what will you do now in this present session of Congress to move the suffrage resolution forward? And so he finds various ways to put them off. He had a lot of ways to avoid this question or to give answers that wouldn't commit him to anything. In one especially annoying dodge, he asked his visitors for background on why they were there. They're there to talk to him about suffrage. He insisted that, well, this is suffrage. What is this suffrage? This is kind of a new subject for me. I've never really heard of it before. Maybe you can give me some background on it. No one's ever talked to me about it before. Of course, people have talked to him about it before, but that was one way of just dodging the question. To others, he would say the very common one, this is a state matter, not a federal matter. Later, he would say that since support for the suffrage amendment was not in the Democratic platform, the platform of his party, that he was unable, just simply unable to speak on behalf of something that isn't in the platform. And of course, we know that's not true. And the suffragists who met with him also knew that wasn't true. The reality is that he was personally opposed to women voting. It was a lifelong conviction as a matter of principle, and he wasn't going to violate it. And he said that privately. And he said that to some of his audiences with women. There were, however, members of both houses of Congress who were willing to take up the cause, mostly Republicans, though, who were in the minority, but some Democrats as well. Suffrage did have support in Washington, but to move forward in that political climate, it was going to require really careful political strategy. Two important suffrage organizations would approach Washington politics differently. The NASA, the older organization, tried to be nonpartisan, to look for allies wherever they could find them, no matter what party they were in, and to try to find a constructive way to deal with the campaign. How long must women wait for liberty became the focus of other National Women Party's protests in coming months. Oh, we're up there. Okay. So let's see. Yep. We saw that one. Here's the image of the Western women are going to carry the torch of liberty to help enfranchise the Eastern states. Okay, here's the presidential election of 1916. Thank you for your help. On election night, this will sound eerily familiar. We've seen this before. It initially looked like Hughes was winning on election night. It takes a long time to get all the results in, takes a long time to get the results from the West in. And in this case, it actually took several days before all the results were counted. It was a very close election, and California, which was a suffrage state, ended up bringing it home for Wilson. Wilson won by fewer than 3,500 votes in California. The only suffrage state to go for Hughes was Oregon. So suffrage strategists, the National Women's Party, had assumed that where women could vote, they would vote for Hughes because he endorsed the federal amendment. But of course, people make their voting decisions for all kinds of complicated reasons. Most people aren't single issue voters. And suffrage was not necessarily the most pressing issue of the time. Wilson had run on a pledge to continue to keep the United States out of the European War that had started in 1914. He had pledged this position of neutrality that allowed Americans to trade with anyone in Europe on either side of the war. That was his definition of neutrality. He knew that he really didn't have that much power to keep the United States out of war, because at some point, Germans were going to attack American merchant ships and get dragged into the war. But he still ran on that, he kept us out of war campaign. Hughes also did not want to enter the war, but he was reluctant to make the kind of promises that Wilson was making. And so Wilson was successful in running as a peace candidate, which likely trumped Wilson's opposition to suffrage with a lot of women voters in 1916. This was the narrowest victory in the popular vote by an incumbent up to that point. It was very narrow. The Democrats' majority in the Senate was also narrowed, and Democrats lost the House. Very close election. I just feel like when I make a big movement, I'm going to turn off the slides again. So I'm going to try to. So Wilson is reelected. On January 10th, 1917, the National Women's Party began a new tactic. This is when they began picketing in front of the White House, for which they're very famous. They are the first group to do this, to exercise their political voice in front of the White House like that. They remain silent with their backs up against the fence there, very dignified, dressed in white, holding banners. They came back every day for weeks and months, except Sunday, through all kinds of weather. On March 4th, which was the date of Wilson's inauguration, 1,000 women stood there in the rain. They were protesting silently, and their banners said things like what you see in this slide here: "Mr. President, how long must we wait for liberty?" Right, that's that saying. And initially, Wilson is fairly tolerant. He's essentially ignoring them. Then in April, after escalating German attacks on U.S. merchant ships, the United States does enter the Great War. Wilson hoped that suffragists would not want to present themselves as unpatriotic by continuing to criticize him during the war, and that he would therefore, that they'd sort of stop their campaign for suffrage, they'd rally around the war, and that he wouldn't have to deal with them. Yeah. NASA pledged support to the war effort, but also declined to suspend the campaign for suffrage. NASA felt like they could do both those things at the same time. They could volunteer for the war effort and campaign for suffrage. The National Women's Party under Alice Paul made no promise to support the war and made no promise to suspend their pickets. Wilson wanted nothing to do with Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, but he's starting to feel like NASA and Carrie Chapman Catt are maybe a little easier to deal with. So he starts talking a little bit more with them. The National Women's Party pickets continue, and they become more and more controversial because the country was at war. It didn't seem right to a lot of people to be criticizing the president. And both the administration and the public would soon become even less tolerant. On June 20th, I know you can't read this, but I'll tell you what it says. Lucy Burns and Dora Lewis, who are two National Women's Party members, they showed up at the White House with a new banner that referenced remarks that Wilson and his ambassador, Root, had recently made to the new Russian ambassador. The Russian Revolution had occurred. The provisional government is in power, not the Bolsheviks yet, but the provisional government. They have enfranchised women. There's a lot of concern that the new Russian government is going to negotiate a separate peace with Germany and pull out of the war, which would end the Eastern Front in World War I. So the Americans really want to keep Russia in the war. And Ambassador Root had made comments to the Russian ambassador that implied that the United States is a democracy. Woodrow Wilson, our president, was elected with equal and universal suffrage. because the Russians had, in this period, had enfranchised women. So what this banner says there is, and just try to imagine how inflammatory this is in the early stages of the war. To the Russian envoys, it says, President Wilson and Envoy Root are deceiving Russia. They say we are a democracy. They want you to help us win a world war so that democracies may survive. We, the women of America, tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million American women are denied the right to vote. President Wilson is the chief opponent of their national enfranchisement. Help us make this nation really free. Tell our government that it must liberate its people before it can claim free Russia as an ally. Like before you agree to stay in the war, tell President Wilson you better enfranchise women. So these are really shocking things to say. An angry crowd destroys the banner. They taunt the picketers, accuse them of treason, and physically assault them. So they keep coming back every day with these banners. The banners are destroyed. They come back with another one. There's essentially riots in front of the White House every day. This begins then a showdown over the pickets. Wilson's Committee on Public Information, the Creel Committee, which was essentially a kind of wartime propaganda committee, was working with the press to run negative stories about the picketers. One headline in the paper said, "Shut up or be locked up." Right? It's really very chilling. The DC police arrested women on the charge of blocking traffic, which is why I made a big deal about how they're standing back here against the fence. As you can see, sidewalks are really, they probably in front of the White House go back to where Marjorie is sitting there. Like they're not blocking the sidewalk, but that's the charge. Women were arrested. They refused to pay their fines. They went to jail. Some were sentenced to 6 months or more in horrendous conditions. Several, including Alice Paul, went on hunger strikes and were forcibly fed. These stories are horrific. They're pretty well known. I can give you some sources on where you can learn more about them. What is perhaps less well known is how heavy a hand President Wilson played in bringing all of this about. As president, he had powerful control over the DC police and the DC courts. He was the one who appointed the superintendent of the DC police and the judges. So when Police Superintendent Pullman decided to start arresting the picketers, he did it with President Wilson's blessing. The police were essentially taking their orders to arrest women from the White House. The people who were physically attacking the protesters, the women, many of them were Navy and Marines in their uniforms. Others were government employees who worked for the Wilson administration. Though the people who were attacking the picketers were not arrested for their actions, they weren't fired from their jobs, they weren't disciplined. These appalling assaults on freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly were essentially directed by Wilson through people who worked for him. Eventually, there was one member of his administration who did support suffrage and was so appalled by this that he actually did resign from the Wilson administration. Meanwhile, the suffrage amendment had been introduced in the House and the Senate in April 1917. So while these pickets are escalating, the amendment is moving through. It looked as though it's starting to gain more support. And as the amendment is gaining more support, the pickets in front of the White House, the tension over that is escalating. And Carrie Catt from the NASA called the picketers the greatest obstacle now existing to the passage of the federal women's suffrage amendment in Congress, because they're making a spectacle of themselves. They're showing their disloyalty to the president. They're hurting the cause of suffrage. It's going to be that much harder for us to get members of Congress to vote for this when this spectacle is going on in front of the White House. NASA was able to take advantage of the fact that Wilson found them more easy to deal with than the National Women's Party, And so they are able to talk with him. But when he finally begins to succumb to the pressure, it's not, I don't believe, because he was ever persuaded by the arguments of the suffragists from any camp to have a real change of heart. He doesn't really come to believe that it's a good idea for women to vote. What happens is that leaders in his own party concluded that suffrage was going to pass. Whether we like it or not, it's going to pass. It's becoming more popular, and it would be better for Democrats to get the credit for it than for Republicans to get the credit for it. A key concern in late 1917 was New York. There had been repeated efforts to enfranchise women in New York that went down to defeat many times, but in 1917, New York women won the right to vote. That victory in New York was really sobering for National Democrats, because let me show you this map again. New York, you can't read it, but you obviously know where New York is. It was a very populous state. Enfranchising women in New York added millions more women voters to the electorate. New York at that time had the highest number of electoral votes, 45. It had the largest congressional delegation. The Democratic House leadership was very worried that it would lose its majority in 1918 unless the Democratic Party changed its position on suffrage. So a small cohort of Democratic leaders who were close to Wilson met with him and managed to get him to support the amendment. This is in the winter of 1917, 1918. So he supports it, but he does it like kind of through clenched teeth and very quietly. He wouldn't issue a public statement saying that he had changed his position. What he did say is he says, if any Democrats want to come meet with me and talk with me privately, I'll talk with them about why I think they should support it. In January 1918, the House narrowly passed the Anthony Amendment with just barely the 2/3 votes that was needed. Wasn't clear whether Wilson's change of position had really made a difference with Democrats, but the Democrats controlled the Senate, so the amendment would need him to do a lot more if it was going to pass the Senate. By September, the Senate still hadn't voted, and Wilson was persuaded finally to give a speech to the Senate in which, for the very first time, he would assert that passage of the Anthony Amendment is vital to winning the war. So please do it. But when the Senate voted in October, it fell short. The 1918 midterm elections were coming up, and on November 5th, Republicans won both the House and the Senate. Later in May of 1919, both houses finally passed the Anthony Amendment. That's the final leg in Congress. When that happened, credit mostly went to Republicans. As you know, the 19th Amendment was ratified in August of 2020. By the end, Wilson was preoccupied with negotiating the peace in Paris, and then by his debilitating stroke. So I was going to propose some possible political lessons to learn from this episode. I love that banner. He's really, really not enthusiastic about this, but the suffragists are gonna, he said it, we're gonna use his words. We've used his words against him. We can use his words for him. Different political strategies by different organizations with common goals can complement each other. I think that's sometimes something that we can forget, that we can share a goal and have different ideas about how to get there. These two, it's easy to forget now looking back because it looks like the NASA and the National Women's Party, they're all on the same side and they can all blur together. They each thought the other was doing harm to the cause. But what historians would mostly say now is that these very different approaches, do we try to work with the president or do we criticize the president, worked well together. And in this period, these last few years, membership in both organizations, the NASA and the NWP, were going up. Political considerations can be more important than changing hearts and minds. right? Wilson's mind, I don't think Wilson's mind ever changed. But he was persuaded that the political math made it necessary for him to change his votes. I think you can see some of that with President Trump's changing views on abortion. Like he changes his position on that depending on whether he thinks that that's going to be an important issue for him. I don't think he has any really strong convictions about it one way or the other. Another lesson I would say, you all know this lesson, I don't need to tell you this, elections matter. Those 1918 midterms really mattered. Things looked bad in 1916 when Wilson won a new term, but things really changed with the 1918 midterms. The political climate can change very quickly, and finally, progress can happen even when the political headwinds appear fierce. And then I want to conclude just with some possible further reading. That newish biography of Alice Paul, my vision is so bad without my glasses that I want to be able to give you. I can't even, Amelia Fry is the author of that new Alice Paul biography, goes into really great detail of the personal sacrifices that she underwent and her very complicated philosophy in suffrage. The book in the middle, edited by Marjorie Spruill, is an updated version of a book she published back in the 80s, I think, called One Woman, One Vote. It's a collection of essays that have been updated to think about the suffrage movement through the lens of a lot of the work that historians have done in the last 40 years. There's a lot more about Black women in the suffrage movement and immigrants issues, things like that. And then finally, this new biography of Woodrow Wilson by Christopher Cox is one that I just finished reading. And it really, a lot of what I spoke about today was drawn from his perspective, which was really looking at, it's a biography of Woodrow Wilson told through the lens of the women's suffrage movement, which is it's a pretty interesting take on Wilson. So with that, I thank you for your attention. Too long, didn't I? That was wonderful. We could take another few minutes if there are burning questions. There's a question back, Marcia.
When did he have his stroke? And I understand that his wife, who was a very wealthy businesswoman, was making most of the decisions.
Yeah, it's just, and that's his second wife, because his first wife dies while he's president. Yeah, I mean, it's in that period of time when he's trying to navigate his efforts to get the Senate to ratify the League of Nations, and then she's writing. She's doing a lot of the press releases and that being a kind of shadow person. Yeah. Oh, the question was about Woodrow Wilson's stroke. Yeah, and is it true that his wife was actually facilitating a lot of what a lot of his presidency by the end there? Yeah, it is. It is. Mari said it's ironic. It turns out she was able to leave. Yeah. Good.
What was he getting his PhD in?
Political science. And he did complete it, but he didn't. This book goes into a lot of the detail about that. He did not do much of the really rigorous work that was required. It was almost like he was given an honorary degree by the time he got it. But he thought of himself as a political scientist, as a historian. He was very interested in the history of Congress, the history of the United States, the history of the Confederacy, and had, a very Southern take on the history of Reconstruction and how harmful Reconstruction was to white Southerners. Yeah.
Who are the authors of those other two books?
Christopher Cox is the author of the Woodrow Wilson book. Marjorie Spruill is the editor of the book in the middle, which is a collection, and Amelia Fry, the Alice Paul one. The subtitle of the Alice Paul book is Claiming Power. So, yeah, it's a really gripping read. I really loved it. Yeah. Yes.
Wilson make it
difficult or stop having any African Americans in the civil service?
Yeah, that's so he did that. Oh, the question was, thank you. The question was about Woodrow Wilson's segregation of the civil service in Washington. Yeah, he absolutely did that. Hired a lot of people, segregated the federal workforce. When he was president of Princeton, he been really hard on not admitting Black men to Princeton. He didn't admit women. There had been Black men who had attended Princeton before, and he put an end to that, and it remained that way for decades. I mean, and I would say like the racism and the sexism are really entwined in Wilson. They really come out of a particular one worldview, and I've focused primarily on the suffrage part of this, but of course, one of the biggest arguments against women's suffrage was that it would enfranchise Black women. And so much of that opposition, particularly from the southern states, was, we have to tolerate Black male suffrage, although the southern states were doing everything they could to prevent Black male suffrage anyway, but it was intolerable to think that you would now also allow Black women to vote, and that there's some just truly ugly rhetoric around that. Mm-hmm.
I'd just like to add a comment. You mentioned that Woodrow Wilson opposed Black men going to Princeton, and we have a Princeton graduate in the Supreme Court who campaigned on allowing Princeton to have women.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that's interesting, and I share it with you.
Yeah, it took even longer for Princeton to begin admitting women into its, than yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well,
Marty wants me to stop. Yeah. Yeah. I'm happy to answer your question afterwards. Yeah, that's great. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you all for coming. I think this really gave me some food for thought, and I hope it gave some encouragement to those of us who are determined to trudge ahead despite our conditions. So far, we have not been beaten or